The story began with a woman defeating a villain named Rufus lay lightless. His head was cut and rolled to the ground, showing a face full of despair. The woman celebrated with her teammates after their victory. But the protagonist could not accept that ending. He believed it should never have happened. He looked as if he had just woken from a terrible dream. This boy was the heir to the Marquisate of Lightless, and there was no way he could allow such a pathetic death to become real. He had to prevent it no matter what. When a butler asked where he was going, the boy said they needed to hurry to Roguebelt. If that nightmare had even the slightest chance of coming true, he would destroy it with everything he had. A day earlier in the mansion of the Lightless family, Rufus, the young heir, sat at the table staring blankly at his food. His personal butler, Carlos, approached and joked that such a pouty look would ruin his cute face. Rufus told him to stop calling him cute, reminding him that he was already 12 years old. Carlos replied that cuteness was justice. Rufus became angry and warned that today might be the day of the butler's life. Carlos calmly said he was not afraid to lay down his short life for him. Rufus told him that a servant's life and fate were always in the hands of his master. He found it insulting to be called cute because he was already an adult who drank black coffee every day. He took another sip and noticed its pleasant aroma, realizing that the brewer had worked hard to perfect it. The butler then said that if he died, Rufus would no longer be able to drink such good coffee, which would be a real loss. Rufus paused for a few seconds and claimed he would allow him to live long out of mercy. The butler had no objection and promised to live a long and humble life. Still, Carlos pointed out that Rufus seemed to be in a bad mood that morning. Rufus blamed it on the butler's provocation. Carlos denied any fault, though he mentioned that Rufus's last in being this upset was when he fired one of his magic instructors, had already driven away several magic tutors. Rufus claimed it had been quite recent. He fired them off due to their boldness of teaching the great him. Carlos then asked him to ease his mind even a little. He asked for a reason why he was getting upset recently. After thinking for a while, Rufus told him that it was neither a cute nor a funny story. He said he had an endlessly long and terrible dream, then began to tell it. In his dream, there was a young commoner who entered the Academy of Magic. The cruel and arrogant aristocrats looked down on him. But when disaster threatened the world, he joined forces with his friends and defeated the demon lords and dark gods, saving the whole world. In the end, he married the princess and became the king. Carlos said with excitement that it was a powerful story full of drama and happiness, one that would surely become popular. But Rufus grew angry and shouted that there was nothing exciting about it. He asked for coffee to be brought. In his dream, he had seen 5 chapters from the life of the unknown commoner and complained how he sat through all 5 of them in that dream. The butler agreed, but suddenly realized something. He suggested that the story should be expanded, adding a part between the first and second chapters regarding showing a bit too much sympathy towards the villain's side. He said the villain should be made more relatable to ordinary people so the book would sell better. Rufus asked if Carlos wanted to be his editor. The butler then proposed that Rufus write a book based on his dreams, but Rufus told Carlos to say that again after writing one himself. Rufus added that this was not the time for humor. There were moments in the first and second chapters that deeply worried him. In those parts, several evil aristocrats, including himself as one of the villains, were killed by the heroes in the most pathetic way. Carlos curiously asked what kind of wicked acts Rufus had done as a villain. Rufus reminded him of the first chapter of the story, wherein a villainous noble mocked the main character. At the same time, Rufus himself was one of that villain's lackey, but after that, he was cunning and insidious as a minor villain. Carlos listens to his story with understanding and attention. In the second chapter, Rufus becomes a subordinate of the second demon king, one of the 4 heavenly kings, the Shadow Wolf, Rufus. The title Shadow Wolf always fascinated Carlos. Rufus often said he had fought fairly well, but in the second chapter of the story, he died in a very plain and unexciting way. Carlos then realized that his young master was feeling displeased because he was cast as a villain who died halfway through the story. Rufus told the butler that he shouldn't be laughing either, since he was his opening act. In other words, Carlos died before he did. He was the dark butler Carlos. Carlos listened carefully to the story and felt deeply moved. Even in his dreams, he still tried to protect his young master, which made him proud, though it did not help much in the end since they both died. Rufus then came back to his senses with his mood improved a little. He asked his butler to go over their day's schedule. Carlos reminded his master about the day's plan. He had a herbalism practice scene in the garden and a lecture on economics. Later that afternoon, while they walked toward the garden, a large tree suddenly fell because its roots had rotted, blocking their way. Rufus asked what had happened. The gardener suggested taking another route instead of waiting for the path to be cleared, but Rufus became upset. He thought his time was too valuable to waste compared to ordinary workers like them. He told everyone to step aside and cast his dark magic called Dark Scythe. The crowd quickly ran away. In a blink, the fallen tree split apart. A new maid admired his powerful magic, but made a small remark about his behavior. The gardener noticed she was new and told her to look down. The maid was shocked to see the tree neatly cut into firewood-sized pieces. She realized the young master had done it that way, so it would be easier to clean and reuse. The gardener said their master was hard to understand, and they all began carrying the firewood together. As Rufus and Carlos continued walking, the butler gently mentioned that his master might try being kinder to commoners. Rufus claimed he just helped them finish their work faster, but Carlos went on to say that Rufus often appeared cold and proud, even though he was still very young. He explained that all the servants had been trained to serve and respect him. However, his attitude could earn him resentment. Rufus believed that too much kindness could make servants lose their discipline and take advantage of him. He felt it was his duty as an aristocrat to uphold the family's honor. While common people worked hard in the fields and sweated, he was being trained to lead, study, and master many subjects. He had to learn arithmetic, language, combat, economics, etiquette, and magic, all while attending endless lectures and practical lessons. To him, being strict and serious was not just a choice, but a necessary image to keep the dignity of his noble family. That was precisely why that story in his dream disgusted him. What could a commoner with nothing but brute strength possibly do to save the world? Evening arrived. In his room, Rufus was still haunted by the strange dream. He had not told Carlos the full truth, but it was a prophetic dream, clear, detailed, and vivid. As Rufus thought back to it, he remembered that besides the commoner who became king, there were other figures he recognized besides himself. In the second part of the dream, the one who called himself the second demon lord was someone named Raymond Roy Nodensgallen, and several well-known people appeared among the heavenly kings. Rufus had never met Raymond in person, though he had heard about him. The thought bothered him. Why was a duke's son called himself the demon lord, and why had he Rufus served under him? Questions like these filled his mind as he wondered what would happen to him once he entered the academy. Sleep slowly took over and Rufus drifted back into the same dream. The protagonist stood before him asking if there was no other way and talking about someone being sacrificed. It was the same dream, but this time the scene showed a different point of view from the same moment that usually ended his dream. He found himself as the Shadow Wolf, the same creature from his dream who told the protagonist and his friends not to come near because their commoner smell suffocated him. Rufus thought he would die again, just like before, but he could not accept such an ending, especially if this Shadow Wolf would become his future self. When he cast dark magic, he immediately felt his mana running out even before the fight truly began. He wondered what was happening and why he was being forced to fight while pretending to stay calm. He questioned if the Shadow Wolf was a fool. As the battle went on, a screen showed the Shadow Wolf's health dropping fast. The female hero released her magic and declared that she would be the one to kill him. Rufus recognized those exact words from his earlier dreams. His body would not move. He could not even raise a defense. He wanted to ask them to stop. He did not know any of them. He did not want to die. But still, he was killed again. Rufus felt sharp pain run through his body. Even though it was a dream, the pain felt real. In an instant, the scene returned to the moment before the fight started. The Shadow Wolf spoke the same proud words again, but this time he used a different dark spell. Rufus noticed that this was not exactly the same event since the opening move had changed. However, he still ended up defeated and burned to death. He heard the crackling of flames and smelled his own body burning. The heat felt real, and the agony was unbearable. The fight restarted again, and Rufus died once more, this time in a different way. Each death hurt terribly. The next loop ended with him being torn apart by wind magic. The battle repeated endlessly, but Rufus had no idea who these heroes were avenging. The female hero blamed him for the death of someone named Norn and for torturing the villagers with heavy taxes. She insulted Rufus more than anyone else and attacked him again and again to finish him off. Since he always died anyway, he asked her to end everything in one strike. No matter how many times the dream repeated, the Shadow Wolf was always defeated. Rufus thought that the version of him in the dream should heal himself, maybe even have a healing potion. He wondered why he had to wait for the enemy's turn to end, as if he were stuck in a card battle with turns. When the fight started once more, the heroes threw more insults at him. His sense of reason slowly faded. He began to question if he had truly done anything wrong. He wondered why this scene kept repeating. His entire body and soul were crushed again and again. Yet, the cycle never stopped. He clung to his identity, even though dying repeatedly tore him apart. In the end, he just wished to stop existing. By then, the number of times he had died reached 20,882,081 that Rufus finally woke up from a nightmare, his eyes looking lifeless. After staring at the ceiling for a long moment, he slid down to the floor. He slowly walked toward the door and called for someone. Hearing the noise, Carlos ran to him. Rufus asked if he was really Carlos. Carlos tried to calm him, explaining that he was his personal butler and would never leave him alone. Rufus dropped to the floor and broke into tears that he broke down. He exclaimed that he didn't want to die anymore. He ended up crying on the butler's arms. An hour passed, yet Rufus still could not calm down. He continued crying while hugging Carlos tightly, and when he planted his face on his chest, he complained about the smoky smell. Carlos explained that he had dropped everything the moment he heard the crash and rushed to his master. He felt like he had been used as a handkerchief. Hearing this made Rufus feel relieved and grateful. He appreciated how quickly Carlos had come to help him. The butler noticed that Rufus was slowly returning to normal, but he wondered why a man who was always so full of himself had suddenly lost control. He claimed even the other servants were quite startled. A few maids peeked through the crack of the door. Annoyed by their curiosity, Rufus told them to return to their work and stop wasting time. The maids quickly apologized and left. One of them quietly thought that their master looked quite cute with his red nose, while another felt suddenly inspired to work harder to comfort him. Rufus realized that many people had seen his breakdown. Feeling ashamed, he thought it might be better to live alone in another house. When Carlos asked what was wrong, Rufus only said it was nothing. He mentioned that he had another nightmare and then went to the restroom. Carlos started to worry, thinking this was a bad sign since it was already the second day in a row. Meanwhile, Rufus could not stop thinking about his dream. In it, he had felt countless deaths and endless pain until he almost lost himself. To him, it didn't feel like a dream, but an experience. He feared that experience might someday turn real. Still, he reminded himself that he had no reason to follow the same path as in that story. Instead of accepting such a miserable end, he would fight, no matter how shameful it might look. After thinking for a while, he realized that if he had possessed enough magical power, he might have survived. Or if he had never become one of the 4 heavenly kings, maybe those deadly battles would never have happened. He recalled that the story began when the characters entered the Magic Academy 3 years in the future. He believed that avoiding the main hero would be enough to escape his tragic fate. But then he remembered a girl from his dream who was followed by a water spirit. She kept saying that the villagers suffered from heavy taxes because of the Lightless family. It was clear she held a personal grudge against Rufus. After that, he called for the butler. The butler asked if Rufus did not like the warm milk. Rufus was surprised to realize he was actually drinking milk. He told him to stop joking and ordered the butler to check if there was a village in their land that had suffered from heavy taxes. Carlos promised to investigate, though he doubted that the taxes in their territory were higher than in other areas. Rufus kept remembering two words: taxes and village. There had been an episode in the story about subduing sea monsters. Those creatures had attacked a fishing village, which caused the fish supply to drop and made paying taxes almost impossible. Rufus realized he needed to recall the name of that village. It might be the link between his dream and reality. Then he casually mentioned the name Roguebelt. Upon hearing it, Carlos explained that Roguebelt was a small fishing village within their territory. He was surprised that his master was concerned about taxes in such a distant place. Rufus dropped his utensils in shock. He could not believe that Roguebelt actually existed. Carlos asked if Rufus was really worrying about taxes in such a small area. Rufus had thought the name came only from his dream, something unreal, yet was part of the real world. Seeing Rufus' pale face, Carlos assumed he was unwell and suggested rescheduling his plans for the day. Rufus, however, believed that if the name of that remote fishing village was real, it could not be a coincidence that in his nightmare he had died many times, and he was sure he could not be mistaken. He pushed aside his breakfast and rushed out into the street. Carlos called after him, asking where he was going, and Rufus answered that they needed to head to Roguebelt at once. Carlos tried to stop him, insisting that they needed guards, a coachman, and permission from the family head first. Rufus replied that Carlos himself could serve as both guard and coachman. If there were any consequences, he wanted Carlos to tell his father that he alone had taken full responsibility. But Carlos refused and firmly suggested at least informing the family head. Frustrated, Rufus shouted that he suddenly wanted to eat fresh fish that very moment. Carlos then understood what he truly meant and promised to prepare everything for the trip. As Carlos walked away, Rufus remembered that in his dream, his own death had also meant Carlos's death. Everything he had, including his life, was his alone. No one had the right to take it from him, not even God. If fate planned to strike him down, he would strike first, even if it was only a second earlier. He swore to change the future where he had once died. After a long journey, Rufus and Carlos finally arrived at the fishing village. Rufus thought the place looked strange. Carlos checked a map and confirmed that the village was called Roguebelt. They entered Roguebelt, a small fishing village on the edge of their family's territory. As they walked through the quiet streets, they noticed how empty everything felt. Rufus remembered seeing this village in the story from his dream, where it had more people even though they suffered under heavy taxes. In that story, the main character came here to defeat sea monsters, and a girl later joined his crew. Rufus remembered that the same girl had once cut off his head with fierce anger. Despite feeling scared, he needed to find some kind of clue in Roguebelt since he could not return home with nothing. Carlos spotted a hotel sign further down the street and eagerly pointed it out to Rufus, saying they might also get to try the local fish dishes there. The thought of fish made Rufus realize he had wanted to eat some. When they reached the hotel entrance, Rufus noticed that Carlos had sharp eyesight, since from a distance he had mistaken the building for a doghouse. They went inside and found the hotel owner sleeping behind the counter. Carlos tried to wake him up. The man, still half asleep, grumbled and asked if they were the ones who came to collect money again. He said he had nothing left in the shop and told Carlos he was wasting his time. Carlos politely apologized for disturbing him and explained that he only wanted to ask a few questions for his master. The hotel owner looked puzzled that someone so young could be a master. He asked if Carlos was not ashamed to be ordered around by a child. The butler scolded him for his rudeness and proudly said he served a noble and worthy young master. The owner gave Carlos a mocking look and hinted that he acted like a slave. Carlos calmly told Rufus that this was how an untrained commoner behaved. Rufus stayed composed while Carlos told the owner that they did not expect capital-level service and only wanted to know what was happening in the village and why it was so empty. The man hesitated and said that such information usually came with a price. Rufus understood and placed a bag of gold coins on the counter. Still, the owner continued to act rudely and ungrateful. A girl's voice came from behind him, asking her father to stop being rude. The owner shouted angrily that he had told her to stay hidden. The girl fell to her knees and bowed her head, begging for forgiveness and also asking pardon from her father for his disrespect. The owner yelled again and demanded that she raise her head. The girl scolded her father instead, saying these people were different from the usual visitors and that he should bow his head as well. Rufus wondered what kind of foolish scene this was, and if their words were even reaching their minds. At that moment, a group of young villagers rushed into the inn after hearing the shout, saying they came to help. They turned to the butler and asked if everything was fine. Then they saw the girl kneeling on the floor, and anger quickly filled their faces. The crowd began calling Carlos a wicked old man after seeing him force their beloved Lilia to kiss his shoes. Their anger grew, furious that he would dare treat her that way. Many thought he was carrying a weapon. Then the owner shouted that the old man was only a servant and the real boss was the short one beside him. Everyone was stunned. The noise in the crowd grew even louder. People shouted that they would not spare even a child. Some angrily asked if they were goons sent by Clinton. The shouting made Rufus' head ache. He thought the whole village was filled with foolish people who couldn't see the truth. How could they mistake him for someone's hired thug? Carlos then guessed they were talking about Clinton F.A. Serpentic, the local magistrate of Roguebelt. Rufus felt puzzled for a moment. In the third part of that dream, he had heard a story about a magistrate who unfairly raised taxes and made people suffer. He remembered that he had once died because of that man's cruelty and sins. Rufus tried to stay calm and asked if anyone could speak with him properly and tell him more about this Clinton. The crowd only grew more shocked, unable to believe how bold and arrogant he seemed. Suddenly, someone in the crowd shouted, and a man stepped forward. He had long hair tied in a braid. He mocked the crowd and said the boy was a true noble, warning that anyone who harmed him would lose their head. People felt relieved when Greg appeared. He apologized for the crowd around them and promised he would not let anyone else cause trouble if they let Lilia go. Rufus pointed out that if Greg knew he faced an aristocrat, he should show better manners and at least say who he was. Greg bowed and said he led the local sailors. Rufus felt they could at least have a conversation. Carlos noticed Greg stood with one hand on his sword. That small gesture showed he had experience. Although he seemed rough, Greg looked like someone who could be reasoned with. Rufus made it clear he had not been holding Lilia. The girl lowered her head and looked afraid. The others doubted Rufus. He walked up to Lilia, took her hand, and gently pulled her up. She felt as if she had become a noble lady for a moment. This showed what a true gentleman could do. Rufus then moved toward Greg and pushed Lilia toward him. Greg realized Rufus seemed distant, but was not a bad child. Still, everyone thought Rufus was hard to tolerate. Greg stepped closer and wondered if Rufus had come to the village with bad intent. Rufus answered that needlessly wiping out a whole village would only cause trouble. Greg glared at Rufus, who started to wonder if this was one of those moments when commoners turned against a noble out of anger. If a fight broke out, Rufus thought it would count as treason and the whole village could be executed under the kingdom's law. But Greg said he didn't care about such laws. Instead, he asked if Rufus would forgive them for their rudeness if they cried and bowed their heads in thanks for his mercy. Rufus coldly replied that he had no interest in Greg's head, but if Greg really wanted to bow, then he could go ahead. Rufus didn't care about this matter at all. Greg was caught off guard by his response. He couldn't figure out what kind of noble Rufus was, but he was sure Rufus was nothing like that Clinton scoundrel. Rufus said he did have one demand. He wanted to know more about Clinton. He started by asking if the villagers were truly on bad terms with him. Hearing Clinton's name made Greg furious. He said that if anyone ever saw Clinton's face again, they would risk their lives just to kill him. Rufus remarked that it felt like he was talking to a barbarian instead of a commoner. Greg didn't even try to deny it. He went on to explain that Clinton had been robbing the village under the excuse of tax collection and even kidnapping women when there was nothing left to take. Clinton, he said, was far savage than the villagers themselves. Greg then apologized for avouing to tell such a terrible story to Omion as young as Rufus, like a tea that meant. Someone from the street shouted for Greg. A man was yelling that Clinton's people were coming and they were already getting closer. Greg rushed outside, ordered everyone not to leave the property, and turned to Carlos, telling him to protect the young master. Carlos already knew his duty and didn't need more instructions. Rufus then called out to Carlos and told him that if things were truly that bad, they should try petitioning the Lightless family right away. Greg yelled back that he would think about that and left. Carlos believed that Greg didn't understand what was really happening, and Rufus muttered that ignorance was really a crime. Meanwhile, Clinton's men moved through the streets, shouting that they were collecting taxes and demanding that everyone hand over their remaining valuables. They warned that anyone who resisted would be killed. A group of local sailors armed with pitchforks, clubs, and whatever they could find came forward to fight. They had nothing left to give and charged at the soldiers. A violent fight broke out, turning the street into chaos. Rufus and Carlos watched the scene from the hotel window. Rufus claimed he didn't recall learning that forced collection was carried out through proper procedures. Carlos replied what was happening was nothing but daylight robbery. Just then, the front door of the hotel burst open from a hard kick. One of the collectors spotted Lilia hiding inside and called out to his captain. Lilia tried to run and called for her father to follow, but he was busy gathering their family treasures and couldn't make it in time. The soldiers saw her, and the father begged them to let his daughter go, offering all the family silver instead. The guards ignored him and shoved the father aside roughly. Rufus asked Carlos if it was possible for him to personally deal with Clinton. The butler calmly replied that he could not act without the head of the family's permission. Rufus thought that as the eldest son, he should have some authority over lower officials, but he knew that doing so would make it seem like he was blaming his father for appointing them. He believed the best approach was to gather evidence of wrongdoing and find the real cause of the problems before taking any action. Carlos listened carefully and saw in Rufus the qualities of a future family head. The young man had a strong sense of justice and already showed the ability to manage a small territory. However, when Carlos noticed Rufus' angry expression, he quickly withdrew his thoughts. Meanwhile, the captain of Clinton's inspection team spotted Rufus and Carlos. He ordered his men to take all their valuables and to kill the old butler if he resisted. The captain himself turned his attention to the young girl, pushing her down under the excuse of inspecting her. Lilia cried for help, but Rufus remained seated during the chaos. Carlos, judging the situation with his years of experience, realized it was time to act. He stepped forward, called the collectors fools, and declared that he would never let bandits rob his master. The men were shocked to be called bandits, but Carlos went further and called them vermin instead. Angered, one of the collectors charged at Carlos with a sword, shouting that the dark nobles supported them and that House Lightless stood behind their actions. He called Carlos insolent for daring to resist. Carlos blocked the attack, putting his body between Rufus and the blade. Rufus saw clearly that his loyal butler had risked his life for him. Trembling, Carlos turned to Rufus, his face pale and marked with a small bleeding cut. Rufus rose to his feet, his anger burning. He declared that the collector had wounded his servant and insulted the name of House Lightless. That alone was enough reason to punish Clinton and his men. Calling upon a magic of the Hand of Darkness, Rufus unleashed his power. In an instant, the collectors froze. Unable to move, he dragged them out of the room and threw them aside like broken dolls. Shock spread through the group as they saw their captain fall. The captain stood back up, his face twisted with rage, and ordered his men to kill both Rufus and Carlos. As they walked outside, Rufus praised the butler for his impressive acting skills. Carlos then asked the young master if he should finish everyone off, but Rufus told him to keep it moderate. He explained that it was hard to tell the barbarians apart from the villagers, and they couldn't risk hurting innocent people. Using magic in this situation was too dangerous, so Rufus ordered Carlos to handle the enemies on his own. The butler accepted without hesitation. Carlos stepped forward and moved with incredible speed, showing flawless swordsmanship. Despite his age, he leaped around lightly, striking with perfect precision. In a short time, he defeated each of the collectors one by one. His movement showed great power and control, and soon the entire battle was over. When Greg arrived, he was shocked to see that the old man had single-handedly taken down an entire squad. Carlos bowed and apologized to Rufus for showing such a rough scene, but Rufus was pleased. He reminded everyone that his butler had once been a captain of the Dark Knights under House Lightless, and even in old age, his skill with the blade remained remarkable. Carlos looked proud and honored by his master's praise. At that moment, Clinton's men hurriedly retreated. Greg shouted after them, telling Clinton that the village would take this matter straight to the Lord since they would no longer keep Pushade around. Rufus could not tell them that the direct appeal had already been achieved through his presence. As they left the village, Carlos asked the young master if it was right to let the private soldiers escape. Rufus said it was fine because they were heading to Clinton's mansion anyway. He added that it saved them the trouble of sending a message about what happened. When they reached their carriage, Rufus suddenly sensed something strange nearby. A heavy feeling filled the air, and he thought he heard something from the sea. It sounded like a wave of magic pulling him down into the depths. He realized it was something familiar. Knowing the future, he had tried to change it, but he wondered if it had appeared too soon. It was the sea monster that was supposed to emerge 3 years later. The sea demon Strafe, one of the Demon King's vassal beasts. Rufus stood by the seashore for a while longer. Carlos called out to him, asking if he felt unwilling to leave the sea behind. Rufus walked toward the carriage, realizing that the butler had not sensed the strange wave of energy from earlier and seemed unaware of what had happened. Rufus muttered that he would never set foot in this place again. Soon after, they began their trip to Clinton's residence. Carlos swore that he would gather the needed evidence right away and deliver both it and Clinton to the family head. Rufus wondered what kind of excuse that man would come up with this time. When they reached Viperport Harbor Town, where Clinton lived, Rufus looked more tired than ever. Clinton claimed he knew nothing about the recent events that had ruined the noble name of Lightless and caused looting in the area. He insisted that the tax collectors must have acted on their own and promised to find and punish those responsible for robbing the townspeople. Rufus found this neat excuse dull. Despite being called Snake by both name and nature, Clinton was acting more like a lizard that cut off its tail to escape danger. Rufus asked why the tax collection had fallen behind. The official replied that the peasants kept giving endless excuses. Rufus ignored the excuses and pressed for the real reason. Clinton explained that the town's people claimed monsters had appeared in the nearby sea, ruining the fishing grounds and leaving them unable to pay their taxes. Rufus began to wonder if Roguebelt truly faced a fishing problem or if the monsters were real. He remembered seeing these events in a dream, though they were supposed to happen 3 years later. Sitting quietly, he fell deep into thought. Clinton added that he had never heard of a large-scale monster outbreak outside of dungeons. Rufus thought about how the fate of the village was linked to his own survival. He knew he had to stay focused because the future he once dreamed about was already starting. If the monster outbreak followed the same story he remembered, then the cause would be the colossal demon kraken, Strafe, which had once raged off the coast of Roguebelt. Even the two main heroes of that story had struggled to defeat it. The only way to win back then had been through a massive naval operation that cost a great amount of money. Powerful sea weapons were needed, and they were very expensive. In the story, the king's support during the Demon Lord's return had made it possible. But this time, Rufus had to find the funds on his own. At that moment, Carlos returned. Rufus said he had been waiting for him for quite some time and that he was already tired of talking with Clinton. Carlos leaned closer and quietly told him that he had found what they were searching for. It was in the next room in the basement below. Rufus smiled and covered part of his face with his hand, his mood improving right away. He declared that everything so far had been boring and said that Clinton seemed like a more interesting person. Clinton felt confused and shocked. Rufus explained that Clinton had been involved in unauthorized taxes, embezzlement, looting, and kidnapping. He said his servant had already gathered proof of all those crimes, but with a wide grin, Clinton thought that this kind of exposure was within his expectations. He believed that as long as he had money, he could recover. Rufus then announced that Carlos had found hidden money underground and even discovered a statue made of pure gold. Clinton jumped up, filled with fear and anger. He claimed he knew nothing about it. Rufus said that if that was true, Clinton would not mind if he took everything underground as well. Clinton broke into a cold sweat and clenched his teeth. Those were his hard-earned savings, money he had gathered with great effort. He could not bear the thought of losing it to some arrogant youth. Clinton raised his hand, but nothing happened. Rufus asked almost teasingly if Clinton had raised his hand to ask a question. He then asked the butler what he thought about the situation. Carlos explained that the gesture was actually a signal to call his armed men from the next room. Unfortunately for Clinton, they were already asleep. Nearby, the immobilized guards could be seen in the next room, where Carlos had been earlier. Feeling cheerful, Rufus declared that this was now an assassination attempt on a high noble, which meant Clinton had added another crime to his record. This alone was enough reason for an execution to on his knees and beg for mercy, offering all the money he had saved. Carlos called him a fool and said that House Lightless would never be moved by bribes. Rufus concluded that he had already secured the money, but now he needed the weapons. He knew the kingdom controlled weapon trading, and the man before him had been smuggling goods and people for gold. A snake like Clinton surely knew his way around the black market, and Rufus wondered if he could use him. Then Rufus said he was willing to give Clinton a chance to atone for his sins. The butler was surprised since the master had just ordered him to collect evidence to report Clinton's crimes to the head of the family. Clinton brightened up and asked what he should do. Rufus told him that he was about to perform a noble act worthy of an aristocrat toward the common people. Clinton was surprised by this. Rufus explained that it might be a difficult task, but it would be a great way to make up for his crimes. Clinton happily agreed, saying he would do whatever was asked as long as he could be forgiven. Rufus was pleased with his answer and declared that Clinton must eliminate the sea monsters terrorizing Roguebelt. Clinton stepped back in fear, insisting that those monsters were just tales made up by peasants. Rufus asked for a pen and paper, saying that if there were no monsters then that was even better. Still, he said that nobles had a duty to help their people in times of trouble, and this would show that sense of duty to everyone. Rufus handed a paper with newly written instructions to Clinton and told him to gather everything listed. Clinton read the note aloud: personnel, weapons, ships, and ammunition. He panicked, unable to understand how such things could be collected so quickly. Rufus told him to use every contact and all the money they had saved. Everything had to be ready by the next morning. When Clinton said it was impossible, Rufus coldly replied that if it could not be done, then he might as well die there. As Carlos drew his sword, Clinton ran out in fear, shouting that he would prepare everything at once. After putting his sword back, Carlos called to his young master. Rufus turned to look at him and noticed the butler's troubled face. Carlos asked where Rufus had learned such cruel methods. Rufus wondered if Carlos planned to tell his father, but since they had sneaked out, Carlos said it was already too late for that. Rufus replied that his father would judge only by the results and asked Carlos to stay with him a little longer. Carlos agreed to follow his orders. Rufus knew he was the only one who could take action. Believing the cause of the suffering fishing village was already set, he decided to do whatever it took, even if it meant using dirty money. The next morning in Roguebelt, a young mother and her daughter went to the seashore to watch the sunrise. The girl gazed at the bright rays of the rising sun and noticed several ships moving closer from a distance. She told her mother that many large ships were coming their way, that a boy sitting on a tree branch nearby realized that the nobles were attacking from the sea this time. He jumped down from the tree beside the mother and daughter. As the girl tried to run, she tripped and fell. The boy quickly lifted her up and asked if she was hurt. The girl was surprised to see the boy named Fo, but said she was fine. Fo smiled, knowing she was strong, like most children raised in Roguebelt. He told her it was time to play hide-and-seek and warned her not to let anyone from outside the village find them. Then he ran toward the shore. He did not care who the attackers were. The moment they stepped on land, he would defend everyone in the village this time. Meanwhile, as the ships neared the shore, Rufus and Carlos climbed into a rowboat and started rowing toward land. Carlos mentioned that even if they had never planned to return, fate seemed to have pulled them back to Roguebelt. Rufus said it was troublesome that they still needed someone who knew the waters well. As they got closer, Carlos noticed how cautious the villagers looked. Rufus hoped the people would calm down once they recognized their faces. The first person to meet them on the shore was Greg, the leader of the sailors. He said they had vanished the day before without even saying goodbye, and now they had suddenly come back. Rufus explained that the villagers could not pay their taxes because of the monsters, so it was time to deal with the problem once and for all. Greg was shocked. He looked at the fleet anchored near the coast and wondered if they had gathered all those ships just to wipe out the sea monsters. Rufus told him he did not come for a small extermination. He said he would wipe out the monsters completely and destroy every last one of them. He also told Greg that the villagers should stay hidden and keep out of the way. Greg apologized and admitted that just the day before he had disliked all nobles. But now he found himself deeply admiring Rufus. Rufus told him not to go too far with the compliments because they were starting to bother him. Greg then asked why Rufus cared so much about their village. Rufus replied that he had already dealt with a troublesome snake. Greg asked if he meant Clinton, but before he could answer, a young man appeared at the pier. He drew his weapon in anger and rushed toward them. Carlos quickly pulled out his own weapon and blocked the attack, but FO dashed at Rufus with unbelievable speed and landed a punch on his face. Carlos shouted for his young master, but Rufus said he was fine and ordered him not to interfere. Blood dripped from his mouth as Rufus admitted he had grown overconfident. FO was stunned by the killing intent he felt from someone so young. Rufus had already noticed FO charging from distance, but his speed up close was incredible, and he had gone straight for Rufus, the leader himself. Greg yelled at FO, calling him a fool for attacking the man who came to help the village. FO asked if this was really the noble everyone was calling their savior. Greg confirmed it was true, but FO said that was all the more reason not to let them into the village. Rufus taunted him for acting ungrateful toward the person trying to save them, then agreed to hear what he had to say.